A little over a year ago, I was living in an apartment trying to save up some money. It was a small one-bedroom arrangement, and the rent was somewhat manageable. At the time, I wasn't dating, and I surely wasn't looking to date either. I was happy enough going to my 9-to-5 job, then coming home to relax with some video games. The apartment building itself was alright. It was nothing to write home about. Everything on the inside worked, and for the most part the tenants were quiet and kept to themselves. The one downfall for me, though, was the view from my balcony. I don't know if this is an unpopular opinion, but I wanted the third-floor apartment so I could sit outside and read or take in the fresh air. The fact that I had another apartment building in my direct line of sight was kind of a buzzkill for me. It wasn't like it was a huge deal, though. I did end up making peace with it after a while and just learned how to ignore it. It's strange how the separation of the building makes a huge difference, though. For example, my apartment building was just a little nicer and had very little of any type of crime. Meanwhile, that other apartment building seemed to always have police cars swarming outside. The area itself spanned multiple blocks, and I think there were 6 or 7 different apartment buildings there. When I say buildings, I mean different apartments altogether, like each block of apartments was a different leasing company. The first few were really nice, and the further you progressed through the blocks of apartments, the less nice they became. I was in the last building before they really started to go downhill. Like I said though, I got used to that sort of thing. Every once in a while I would get to see a show, better than you could watch on any cop show. At some point during the lease of my apartment, I had come home from a hard day's work and just wanted to sit outside and relax a bit. It was one of those beautiful nights in the early summer. I didn't want to go inside. I grabbed my laptop and started watching stuff out there with my headphones on. Before I knew it, it was well after midnight, and I was still sitting outside enjoying the free breeze. I finished up what I was watching and decided to just sit outside and really soak in the air for a while until I went inside to go to sleep. Immediately after taking my headphones out, though, I noticed something strange from my balcony vantage point. I saw a figure pacing back and forth outside the apartment building behind me. I felt comfortable practically spying on this person, since there was no way he could possibly see me. I mean, I was dressed in all black on a third-floor balcony, slouched back in a chair. I watched this person pace and continue for 5 minutes. I was trying to theorize what this person was doing. My first thought was that maybe they'd gotten locked out and were pacing waiting for someone to let them in, but that theory faded quickly when I noticed how suspiciously he looked when he stopped pacing. He would look all around himself, like he was trying real hard to be secretive. I could clearly make out some of his features once he started to look around too. He had a very thick beard and was wearing an Atlanta Braves baseball cap. He had a hood on top of the hat as well. I could see long hair protruding from the sides of it. This person slowly approached the sliding door. It must have been locked or something, because after a couple of attempts of trying to open it, he stopped and walked over to another apartment. When he reached that next apartment, he grabbed the door as well. A car drove by though, and he jumped away from the door and pretended like he was just walking down the road. Once the car was out of sight, he went back to the door and tried to open it again. No such luck for this man, it seemed. I oddly felt a sense of relief when he started to walk away. Whatever intentions he had, and it didn't seem like they were good, it looked like he was abandoning them. I felt a bit of relief lift off my shoulders too, because I'd been having an eternal battle on the inside of whether or not I should call the cops on this guy. I mean, of course, I probably should have. But for some reason, calling the cops on this guy was giving me crippling anxiety. I can't explain why. I guess the police just terrify me, so I avoid that confrontation at all costs. Just as the relief was setting in completely though, the man turned back around and went back to the apartment he was just at seconds ago. He didn't look around this time. He grabbed onto the sliding door and started to yank on it hard. Thankfully, his failures continued. After that, he went to the last apartment on the ground floor that was in my vision. To my horror and surprise though, the door opened right away. He crept inside, as though he was trying to be silent. I wanted to grab my phone and call the police, but I didn't want to lose my focus on the man. The lights weren't on in the apartment, so I couldn't tell where he'd gone once he went inside. Once I'd lost sight of him completely, I grabbed my phone and called the police. I told them my suspicions, and they said they were going to send a car over right away. I sat on the balcony and continued to watch the sliding door that he'd left slightly open. I saw a light turn on in one of the windows, and within seconds I saw the man running out at full speed toward my building. Even though I knew this man couldn't possibly see me, I slid down in my chair even more. I was so tense. Before the man was even out of sight, a large shirtless man ran out of the sliding door with a baseball bat in hand to chase him. He only took a few steps out though before retreating back into his apartment, closing the sliding door and standing at the window with a bat in hand. I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. I instantly felt guilty for not calling earlier. Then though, I reassured myself it could have possibly been much worse if I didn't call at all. When the cops did finally show up a few minutes later, they talked to the man. I was still watching everything from my balcony. I saw a woman join the big man, as well as 2 teenage children. Within just a couple of minutes, cops were swarming the area. After a lot of conversations with the family, the cops finally left, and eventually the night was quiet once again. I went to bed that night terrified that someone was going to open my sliding glass door, even though it was on the 3rd floor. I feared my apartment was going to get broken into every night until I eventually moved out. I still think about that night all the time, even though it didn't directly involve me. Sometimes being a fly on the wall and witnessing something horrible can be just as traumatic in other ways. At the end of the day though, I'm just happy I don't live anywhere near those apartments anymore, and that the family from the apartment was physically unharmed that night. I can't imagine the psychological damage they're still dealing with today though. This memory of mine begins about 3 years ago, when I graduated from high school. I had grown up with my grandparents, but decided to move to a different and much larger city to live with my dad for the first time in 12 years. I'd went to the city already because I'd spent my summers with him, but this would be the first time I would have the freedom of an adult to come and go as I pleased, drive my car anywhere, smoke cigarettes whenever I wanted. I was excited. I was sad though to have to leave all of my friends behind. As soon as I was settled in, my dad and stepmom sat me down to discuss a few rules and what I needed to know about the basic things. Go whenever you want, but let us know when to expect you to leave and when to come back, even if it's at 2 a.m. so we know you're safe. You know, that sort of thing. I had to park on the street because the apartment complex had limited parking. They both told me to watch out for the neighborhood creep, whose name was George. He was well known to all the women in the complex, as well as the police that patrolled the area. He was tall and fairly huge. He looked very intimidating. My parents were pretty certain he would leave me alone for one reason. My dad thought George had a habit of stalking women in the complex, but he would always stop and find a new target if they had a man nearby. If they made a show of being at their place, be it a brother, a lover, or a father, it didn't matter who or what the man was to the woman. He would back off immediately. Since I was living with my dad, who was quite tall and very intimidating, we felt confident I would be alright. For a time, I was. It started about 6 months after I'd initially moved in. My stepmom and dad were fighting a bit at the time. Eventually, they separated. One night, I was on the porch having a cigarette and browsing Facebook or whatever. I wish I could say I felt like I was being watched. but I ended up just happening to look up coincidentally when I felt a bug land on me. George was standing 15 feet away, a little bit behind a tree, staring intently at me. I nearly dropped my cigarette in surprise. I shakily stubbed it out and went inside. I was home alone at this moment, so I made sure to lock all my doors. Then I started playing video games in my room to relax. I told myself I was probably just being paranoid. The next morning, I got up for a cigarette and some coffee. Lo and behold, only a few minutes after I'd stepped out onto the porch, George came ambling out of his apartment to look my way. I finished my cigarette and went back inside. This pattern continued for a couple of weeks on end. It was like George was always stood at his sliding glass door, peeking out and waiting to see when I would emerge. I told my dad about this, and he tried to sit down with me whenever I would smoke. If my dad was with me, George wouldn't so much as peek his head out the door. Of course, the other woman in the apartment complex had already tried to call the police about George. But since he lived there legally and staring isn't technically a crime, there wasn't much they could do. I didn't know how far George had taken it with the other woman before. With that info in my mind, I knew calling wouldn't be much use. Things slowly began to escalate once my stepmom left though. I had access to her parking spot now, so I had 3 ways to get from my car to the apartment, depending on how I chose to go. One of the ways went just past George's apartment, about 5 feet from his door. Since I got off late most nights, I avoided that route as much as possible. Slowly but surely though, he memorized my schedule. He would always be on one of these 3 paths when I was coming home, not directly on the concrete, but a few feet away hiding in the grass or behind a tree. It's like he really thought I couldn't see him. Almost like a child hiding very terribly behind an object. You could see 90% of his body. That's how he would always do it. I would brush past him and avoid eye contact, but prepare to scream if I heard him coming after me. I started to carry my keys between my fingertips, and I brought a pocket knife with me. I would walk from my car with it halfway open already, even though I'd never been in any fight before in my entire life. I believe it was around this time my mother was trying to find me free self-defense classes, since I couldn't afford anything with my tight budget. My dad was steadily getting more and more pissed off as George got closer and closer to escalating. As the days went by, it went from November to May. If my dad wasn't home, I would have to lock all the doors and keep my knife under my pillow. I would Skype all night with my boyfriend, just in case someone would need to call 911 for me. I put a bunch of flower pots in front of my bedroom window so no one could get inside silently. I started to sit on the floor of my porch below the wall so I would be out of sight whenever smoking. I would anchor myself though so I could see him if he ever tried to walk up to it. I had constant nightmares of me being kidnapped, raped, and murdered. They began to invade my dreams every night. One day, I was gossiping with my neighbor. "Hey, did you hear about George?" "No, what about him?" "He got arrested last night in the parking lot of the complex. There's this big sort of electrical power box that stands about waist height. It's about 2 or 3 feet wide. About 10 minutes before I was supposed to come home and park right in front of it, some lady and her kid were walking by. They saw George sitting behind the box masturbating. He was waiting there for me, jerking off to the thought of me seeing him. It kinda makes me want to puke, but it also scares me at the same time. I was relieved for a few days of my stress, but it was only a few days that he was gone. He went right back again to the same old routine soon after. One night he got even braver. It was about 7 p.m. I went out for a cigarette with my dad. A neighbor walked up to chat with my dad though. George came outside and stood out in the open staring me down. "Dude's asking to get his ass kicked," my dad said. He went back to chatting with the neighbor. I rolled my eyes and went back inside and played some more video games. I was healing in World of Warcraft when I heard my neighbor shouting. I was healing, and that's a pretty important job. I figured she must have been talking to someone else. That was until she burst into my room with panic in her eyes. Her eyes were huge. She hopped from one foot to the other frantically, like she was doing some kind of dance. "He's bleeding," she said. I asked who in bewilderment. "It's your dad. Come quick." I made some teenager huffing sound and left my computer, certainly pissing off the rest of my guild. I grabbed my little first aid kit and filled it with band-aids. I thought my dad was doing something stupid like tossing his knife and trying to catch it or something. But when I stepped outside, I found myself face to face with a real horror. 6 people were surrounding my dad, including my neighbor. My neighbor Caleb was holding a shirt to my dad's side, with my dad facing away from me. His entire back was covered in blood. It was like he'd just been mauled by a bear. Caleb's hold on the shirt slipped, and blood spurted out. I felt queasy writing this down. I had never before in my life seen an emergency like this. Blood makes me lightheaded, and I have anxiety attacks over not being able to find a specific bookmark. All the adults around me were panicked aside from Caleb. I threw the first aid kit onto the porch and told everyone where we kept our towels. Shell rushed inside to grab one. "Has anyone called 911? I shouted. 5 pairs of eyes turned to look at me, like they'd never heard of 911 before. My dad shouted he couldn't afford an ambulance, but I told him to shut the fuck up. He told me that the guy had stabbed him. I dialed 911 and we told them our address and the reason for the emergency. My dad was being a real champ, even though he was spurting out blood all over the sidewalk. I ran back and forth along the walkways to get the police and show them what house George lived in. Then I ran back and forth to get the paramedics. They were so agonizingly slow. They walked calmly, and I wanted to scream at them that my dad was bleeding out. They got my dad packed into an ambulance. I was about to jump in when the police stopped me and told me I had to stay so I could give them a statement. My dad shouted at me to call his boss. 2 years later, and all these memories are still burned into my brain. I gave my statement to the police. Then they made me sit outside the complex on the sidewalk for 2 to 3 hours. They kept me updated on my dad. Once I'd called my boss and answered my stepmother's message, that's when I allowed myself to break down. It felt like I cried on forever. One of the cops was nice enough to go into my house and grab my cigarettes and a bottle of water for me. He stayed with me the entire time to make sure I didn't run off or something, but he was very nice. He even offered to let me sit in his cruiser a few times to get me away from George. He had been waiting in his apartment when they came. When they took him out, I was there. 14 cops were leading him away. He still kept trying to stare at me though. I stared back and felt such hatred I'd never felt before in my entire life. I wanted to go over there and murder him. My babysitting cop looked over and saw George staring at me, so he shined his flashlight in George's eyes to keep him from looking at me. Once it was all over, I was allowed to go back into my house, where I waited for more information about my dad. He was in the hospital for 9 days. Apparently, he'd shouted at George to leave me alone, and George had started shouting back at him while I was in the house. George had screamed at my dad to face him like a man, so my dad jumped over the porch and walked up to him. This creep had been waiting with a 12-inch blade held to the side of his leg, which he struck out and stabbed my dad in the back with. The knife missed his kidney very narrowly. It traveled up and punctured his diaphragm. My dad didn't even realize he'd been stabbed at first. He got George into a headlock and beat the shit out of him, thinking the dude had just punched him in the back or something. George dropped the knife, then rolled in the grass and picked up another knife he'd been hiding and stabbed my dad again. This time, it was an upper back wound that was much more shallow, but still required stitches. This is when all the rest of the stuff went down. The blood stayed on the pavement until about noon the next day, when one of my neighbors kindly washed it off for me. My dad spent more time in the hospital in critical condition than George spent being held in jail. I felt like it was all my fault. I've been addressing that in therapy, but I feel awful about what happened to my dad. Throughout the week, while I was on the porch or even just outside, many women came up to me and told me they had to thank my dad. All of them had been terrorized by George at some point, and now they were certain he would be put away for good after his trial. Several women George had even stalked them up to their apartment door and pull his pants down demanding sex. I can't believe the cops didn't do anything. One day, one of my neighbors came up to me and told me that police and neighbors had searched the complex and found that George had stashed many knives all over the place, buried in gardens, stuck in trees, under his doormat. I shudder to think that maybe one day he planned to grab one of his targets and do something far more sinister than stare. George was declared guilty for assault with a deadly weapon, but the attempted murder charge was dropped. He was out of prison by Christmas on good behavior or whatever. My dad and I have a lifelong restraining order against him. He's never again tried to come after me, so I can only hope he's terrified of my dad. I wish I could tell you guys I took a self-defense course and learned how to fight like my dad did, but I'm still a bit of a punk who can't even slap a spider, so there's that. My dad's doing okay now. I probably owe my life to him. If he hadn't fought George for me, I might have been the first victim George decided to stab. About 4 years ago, one of my work colleagues asked me to dog sit and watch over their house while they were out of town for a few nights. I was decently close with this coworker, so I told them it wouldn't be a problem at all. I'd love to do it actually. I had met their dog Candy on a few occasions and knew I would have no problem being with her for a few days. She could be a little hyper, but usually pretty low maintenance. I figured if I just brought her a new toy, it would distract her for most of the time. I packed a small bag and went over a little bit early so I could get all the details they wanted me to do before they left. Where the dog food was, how often she was to be fed, where her harness and leash were, etc., etc. They had a security system, but they decided they would leave it off while they were gone, so I didn't have to worry about it every time I came and left during the day. They lived in a nice neighborhood anyway. Obviously, I would still lock the doors though. There was a dog living there. I really had no need for the security system to actually be on. She did let me know that even when the system wasn't armed, if the doors opened, you would hear a faint chime. That was the security box letting you know one of the doors had been opened. After getting the rundown, they were off on their trip. I was outside hanging out with Candy the first night. It was fairly uneventful, outside of Candy occasionally trying to eat some grass and dirt. She was perfectly well behaved and even came and laid down with me on the couch when she got tired. I was a little bit annoyed with myself though that I'd brought her a new toy, which so happened to be a squeaker. After 2 hours, I thought I was going to go insane. I didn't sleep well that night either. Something about being in someone else's home alone just couldn't make me relax. Candy couldn't figure out where she wanted to sleep, so she was going up and down in the guest bed to the bed with me, which wasn't really allowing me to get comfortable. The first night came and went. Soon enough, it was already my last evening staying at the home. I remember it was getting kind of late, and I wanted to get some pizza. I ordered it on my phone and ran out to pick it up. I came back and put on the TV. There I was, enjoying my pizza and breadsticks. Before I knew it, the sun was already down, and I was starting to doze off on the couch with Candy. She seemed to be very restless though, which she hadn't been at all before. I figured maybe she needed to go out to the backyard, but when I opened the door to let her out, she just stared out into the backyard and started to whine. She wouldn't go out. She wouldn't go outside, even when the motion light turned on. I didn't close the door right away though, so the faint chiming from the security system was going off to let me know the door was open. I went to go get Candy a treat to see if I could calm her down. I moved her harness and leash out of the way and grabbed her a treat, which she looked very excited about. Her tail was wagging like crazy. I realized it was because she'd heard the jingling from her leash and wanted to go on a walk. It was late and I wasn't sure if I should take her. But if she had to go to the bathroom and wouldn't go in the backyard anyway, I figured I would just take her on a quick walk and calm her down. I almost fell down the stairs trying to lock the front door while she was pulling me in the opposite direction. I started walking down the street, as I wasn't super familiar with this area. I noticed that down the road there seemed to be a park, or at least an area with some open grass. The streetlights gave me a little bit of guidance in the dark. As soon as we went to the grassy area, Candy stormed around and then went to the bathroom. I was relieved and thought this was definitely what she'd needed. As I was done picking up after her, I noticed her ears were raised and she started to whine again. Her whine turned into a low growl. I asked her what was wrong and looked toward where she was looking. There was a person sitting on one of the park swings all by themselves. The park itself wasn't lit, but some of the area around it was being lit by streetlights. The person wasn't moving or swinging at all. They were sitting still as they could, staring in our direction. The only thing I really remember is they had some sort of striped outfit on. The pants and shirt were vertically striped, almost like you'd see on a clown or something. I pulled on Candy's leash to try to get her to move, but she was stuck in place. I shouted under my breath, "Candy, let's go!" As she looked back at me, the person stood up from the swing, staring in our direction. Candy started to bark, and I started walking back towards our house. Even though I was very far away from the swings, I remember starting to jog just to try and get out of there. I wanted to get back to the house as quickly as possible. Once we got back, I gave her another treat and figured we would sit down on the couch. She got into her little dog bed nearby with her toy and laid down, while I put the TV on and started scrolling through my phone. About a half hour later, I kept feeling like I was hearing something, like music maybe. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was nagging at me, so I walked out to the kitchen and realized it was the security alarm unit, chiming and saying the back door was open. My heart sank. Why was this door open? I remembered when I'd tried to let Candy out in the backyard before. I guess I'd forgotten to close it all the way and lock it. That definitely was against my nature even at my own house. I always locked and closed my doors as soon as I got inside out of habit. I closed and locked the door and started to walk back to the living room when Candy was already in the kitchen. She was whining and kind of half growling, barking the exact same as she had earlier at the park. She turned her attention to the stairs leading down to the basement and started full-on barking. As I tried to calm her down, I noticed the light switch to the basement didn't seem to be working, or at least the switch wasn't turning a light on. I walked back to the living room, then went back to the basement stairs after calming Candy down a bit. I turned on my phone light to try and mitigate some of the darkness, and heard what I could only describe as a laugh. I didn't know how else to describe it. I remember turning around and booking it up the stairs, grabbing Candy and running outside. Not knowing what else to do, I called my friend from work and told her what happened. She said she would phone the police and let them know there was an incident, and that I was house-sitting. They could expect me to be there. About 20 minutes later, the police showed up and did a walkthrough of the house and property. They didn't find anything, but they did say the back door was slightly ajar and unlocked. I told them that it had 100% been locked, as I remembered doing it less than an hour ago. They gave me a number and said if anything else out of the ordinary happened to give them a call. I called my friend and filled her in, and apologized for having them worry while they were away. She said they would be home first thing in the morning, and walked me through how to set the alarm for the remainder of the night. I made it through the rest of the night with no other strange occurrences, and I never did get any answers as to exactly what happened.